Hi, welcome to week 4 of the residential real estate appraisal class. It was nice meeting those of you who were able to make the meet and greet last Saturday morning. This is probably the most fun part of the class. This week we will be collecting the data on the class project house. We will be sharing the information with our other group classmates as well. We will also be collecting data on the various relevant comparable sales and sharing them with our groupies as well. By the end of the week, your team leader will be submitting to me the best 5 comparable sales which are relevant to the subject property assignment. On another note, Chapter 10 introduces the income approach to estimate value. If you've taken Real Estate 114, you remember exploring the income approach to estimate value. I had mentioned that it is one of the hardest and misunderstood concepts in real estate appraisal. Direct capitalization sets up the relationship between the income and value of a property. Because of this, we see this as the beginning introduction into the investment property valuations, and hence to the investment property appraisals. Sophisticated commercial appraisal is often reliant on this approach the most. Direct capitalization analyzes the income of the property and the investor's response to that income in the marketplace. Let's take an example. Assume a property produces an income of $50,000 per year. Wouldn't it make sense that if a property were rent, say, for $100,000, twice that much, that it would be twice the value to an investor than one which rented for only $50,000. And yes, that does make a lot of sense. So what we do as appraisers is look at the marketplace and figure out what rate of return an investor is expecting to make on their investments. For example, if we were to be appraising, say, residential units like a fourplex, we would look for comparable units that have been selling in that marketplace. We would be interested in knowing how much rents in the comparable sales we're producing, and we would want to compare that to the property which we are appraising. We would look at how much rent the buildings were making and how much the investors were paying for those properties. In a rough sense, that would give us our expected rate of return. Of course, we would have to take out their expenses to get the real rate of return. Once we knew that rate, which is referred to as the capitalization rate, we could then apply that rate to the rents on the subject property appraisal, and we could determine the value that an investor would pay for the subject property. Chapter 10 also deals with some other hard concepts. It delves into debt coverage ratio and band of investments. Band of investments measure risk in layers, so to speak. This is not an easy concept either. What you have to understand is that this whole talk about the band of investments is a way of arriving at a capitalization rate. So, now you have been exposed to two different ways of arriving at a capitalization rate. One is by the market. We look at other comparable sales. We look at how much rents a property is producing, and we know how much the property sold for. Knowing these two things give us the capitalization rate, that is, the rate of return the investor was expecting to get from the investment. Remember, we have to bring these rents to net rents, that is, rents after expenses, so that it is the true rents to the owner. This, by the way, is referred to as the NOI, or net operating income. That is, rents after all expenses to the owner. So, if a property were making $50,000 per annum after all expenses, and the property sold for $500,000, then the rate of return is 10%. Again, $50,000 divided by $500,000 is 10%. So if we see that most comparable sales are hovering in the 10% range, then we could conclude that the rate of return, or cap rate, is 10% in the marketplace. So if our property we were appraising made $70,000 per annum after all expenses, NOI, then we would conclude that the value of the property was $700,000. This is done by taking the $70,000 NOI and dividing it by 10%. That's right. We take the $70,000 net operating income and we divide it by 10%. And that is one way to get a cap rate from the marketplace. The second way is by the band of investments. This is where the different risk factors are added together to get that cap rate. So those are two ways at this point of which we are now familiar. Now, just a point so that you know a little bit about the marketplace we are in right now in Orange County. Investors are expecting to earn around 6%. So most cap rates for income property are somewhere in that area. Another concept we learned this week regarding the income approach is the gross rent multiplier, the GRM. Sometimes it is referred to as the GIM, the gross income multiplier. It's the same thing. What this concept analyzes is once again the relationship between the gross rent, not the NOI, and the value of the property. For example, if a property were to rent for $2,000 per month and the value of the property was $500,000, then the GRM would be $250. It's actually pretty easy. If you take the rent and multiply it by 250, then you get a value of $500,000. So we can actually look at the marketplace and find these sales. Sometimes we find a single-family residence where the property had been rented when it was sold. And we know how much the rent was, and we can see how much it sold for. So we can do the math and see what the GRM was. Or we can see the sale price and we estimate the rental value and see what the GRM would have been. So if we do that, say 10 to 20 times in our market, we can see what the GRM is. So if we know for sure how much a property is rented, we can apply the GRM and estimate its value. This week's section also talks about the reconciliation process. Very simply, this is when the appraiser analyzes the three approaches used to estimate value in the assignment. We look at the cost approach, the sales comparison approach, and finally the income approach. We determine which method will give us the most credible and reliable opinion of value. For example, if we are reconciling the three approaches when appraising a single-family residence, we would most likely find that the sales comparison approach is the most important. Therefore, we would put most weight on that indicator of value. On the other hand, if we are appraising a 10-unit apartment, we would most likely weight the income approach much higher since we know that it is being purchased for the income. So the cap rate and the rental income are going to be very important. In Chapter 12, it refers to appraisal reports. Be careful. There is mention of some incorrect and outdated information. Complete and limited appraisal reports. This is no longer correct. Any mention of this should be ignored. The 2006 USPAP eliminated these concepts. I think your book has that section crossed out. One of the items in your learning module this week is to download a copy of the USPAP and read Standard 2, which is fairly short but an accurate description of what is expected regarding appraisal reports. In our book, there is mention of a self-contained report, and this is no longer applicable. So make sure you read Standard 2 of the USPAP. This has changed considerably over the years. You should refer to the USPAP 2014 Standard 2 or newer version. It clearly states in Standard 2 that there are only two kinds of written appraisal reports. 1, appraisal report, and 2, restricted use. Oral reports are made so that they follow Standard 2 written reports as closely as possible, for example, if you're testifying in court. Well, it's time to close. I'll see you all next week. Stay in touch with each other. That's really important.